blood on the floor of the emergency room wasn't unusual. The screams of the dying were routine. But the silence that followed the gunfire was terrifying. Margaret Hale was just a 58-year-old charge nurse with bad knees and a pension plan she couldn't wait to cash in. To the doctors, she was invisible. To the patients, she was just the woman who changed the IV bags. But when a paramilitary hit squad breached the hospital doors and the police failed to stop them, the world was about to learn a terrifying secret. Margaret wasn't hiding from the violence. She was waiting for it. And when the Navy SEALs finally kicked down the doors, they didn't come to save her. They came to salute her. This is the true story of the night the Grey Lady went to war. The rain in Chicago didn't wash things clean. It just made the grit streak down the windows of Providence Memorial Hospital like black tears. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. Margaret Hale checked her watch, a battered analog Timex that looked like it had been run over by a tank and put back together. 15 minutes. 15 minutes until she could clock out, massage her swollen ankles, and drive her rusted Ford Taurus back to an empty apartment that smelled faintly of lavender and old books. "Maggie, bed 3 needs a catheter change. He's fighting the restraints again," Dr. Adrian Hayes barked without looking up from his tablet. Hayes was 32, a residency graduate from Yale who thought he was God's gift to thoracic surgery. To him, Margaret was furniture. Necessary, occasionally annoying, but largely invisible. "Already done, Doctor," Margaret said, her voice a low, raspy hum. I also adjusted his sedative drip. He was metabolizing the propofol faster than expected. "Check his liver enzymes." Hayes paused, finally looking at her over his rimless glasses. He frowned, not because she was wrong, but because she was right. I didn't authorize a dosage change. "He was going to rip his stitches out, Adrian. I kept him stable. You're welcome." She didn't call him doctor. She rarely did when no one else was listening. Margaret turned her back on him and walked toward the nurse's station. She walked with a slight limp, favoring her left hip. A souvenir, she told people, from a nasty slip on an icy sidewalk in '98. The truth was a piece of shrapnel from a botched extraction in Mogadishu that still migrated near her sciatic nerve when the barometric pressure dropped. At 58, Margaret was the definition of unassuming. She wore scrubs 2 sizes too big to hide a frame that was more wire and muscle than soft comfort. Her hair was a steel grey bun, tight and severe. The younger nurses called her the Grey Lady. They thought she was lonely. They brought her cupcakes on her birthday, looking at her with that pitying gaze reserved for spinsters who married their jobs. "Hey, Maggie," whispered Jenny, a 22-year-old nursing student with bright eyes and shaking hands. "It's really bad out there tonight, huh?" "The storm." Margaret looked up from her charts. Her eyes were a pale, watery blue, the kind of eyes that looked like they had stared into the sun too long. "It's just rain, Jenny. Rain can't hurt you. Just keep the triage lanes clear. We're going to get the overflow from the pile-up on I-90 soon." "How do you know?" "I can hear the sirens." Margaret lied. She couldn't hear sirens. She just knew the rhythm of the city. She knew that low-pressure systems made people drive aggressively, and the Bears game had just let out. Chaos was a mathematical certainty. Margaret finished her charting and moved to the locker room. She opened her locker, number 104. Inside, there were no photos of cats or grandchildren, just a spare uniform, a bottle of ibuprofen, and a heavy, locked steel box bolted to the bottom shelf. She reached for her coat, a beige trench that had gone out of style 20 years ago. She was tired. Bone tired. Not the fatigue of a long shift, but the fatigue of a long life. She had spent the last 15 years scrubbing blood off floors and listening to arrogant doctors explain basic physiology to her. It was a penance, a quiet life for a loud past. She closed the locker. Click. That was when the sound changed. Margaret froze. Her hand hovered over the combination lock. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. The hospital was a cacophony of beeping monitors, squeaking gurney wheels and distant sirens. But Margaret heard it. It was a thwump, thwump, thwump sound coming from the ambulance bay entrance, 2 floors down. It wasn't a car door slamming. It wasn't a dropped oxygen tank. It was a suppressed HK-416 rifle double-tapping a security guard. Margaret didn't gasp. She didn't scream. Her heart rate actually slowed down. Boom, boom. Boom, boom. She looked at Jenny, who was texting her boyfriend by the door. Jenny hadn't heard a thing. "Jenny," Margaret said. Her voice wasn't raspy anymore. It was cold, clear, and hard as a diamond. Jenny looked up, startled by the tone. "Yeah, Maggie." "Go to the supply closet, the one with the reinforced door on the 3rd floor. Take Dr. Hayes and the patient in bed 4 with you." "What? Why? Maggie, are you okay?" "Do it now, Jennifer." The order carried a weight that physically pushed the girl off the bench. It was the voice of someone who was used to sending men to their deaths. Before Jenny could ask another question, the overhead PA system crackled. But instead of the usual code blue, or doctor to ER, there was a chaotic, wet gurgle, followed by a thick, Eastern European accent. "Lock the doors. No one leaves. We are coming up." Then, the fire alarms triggered, plunging the locker room into strobing red darkness. Margaret sighed, unbuttoning her beige trench coat. She turned back to her locker. She spun the dial on the heavy steel box at the bottom. "I really wanted to watch Jeopardy tonight," she whispered to the empty room. From the box, she didn't pull out a stethoscope. She pulled out a compact Sig Sauer P365 and 2 spare magazines. She racked the slide. The nurse was off duty. The asset was clocked in. Providence Memorial was a Level 1 trauma center designed to handle mass casualties. It was a labyrinth of sterile corridors, negative pressure rooms, and heavy fire doors. Tonight, it was a cage. Down in the ER lobby, chaos reigned. 6 men moved with fluid, predatory precision. They weren't street thugs holding Glocks sideways. They wore nondescript black tactical gear, heavy ceramic plates under oversized windbreakers, and carried carbines with expensive optics. They moved in a rolling T formation, sweeping the room, checking corners. The leader, a towering man with a scar running through his left eyebrow, stepped over the body of the front desk security guard. He checked his wrist computer. "Target is on floor 4, cardiac ICU, VIP wing," the leader said. His name was Voron. "Secure the elevators. Anyone with a phone dies. We have 10 minutes before SWAT creates a perimeter. We need the asset and out." They were there for Senator Mitchell's son. The boy had been brought in 4 hours ago with an overdose, but he wasn't just a junkie. He was the only witness to a massive arms deal that had gone south in Ukraine 3 days prior. The CIA had stashed him here under a fake name, thinking he was safe. They were wrong. Up on the 4th floor, the panic was spreading like a virus. Nurses were screaming. Patients were crying out in confusion. Dr. Hayes was running down the hallway, his lab coat flapping. "We need to evacuate," Hayes yelled, grabbing a nurse by the arm. "Get to the stairwell." "No," a voice said from the shadows. Hayes spun around. Margaret stepped out of the linen closet. She looked different. The hunch in her shoulders was gone. She stood 6 feet tall, her posture perfect. She held the pistol in a low, ready position, tight against her chest. Hayes blinked, his brain unable to process the image. "Maggie, what the hell is that? Is that a gun?" Stairwells are fatal funnels, Margaret said, ignoring his hysteria. They'll have a two-man element covering the exits. You run down there, you're dead. Are you insane? Put that away. I'm reporting you to... Margaret stepped forward, grabbing the lapel of Hayes's expensive coat. She slammed him against the wall. The move was so fast, Hayes didn't even feel the impact until he was pinned. Listen to me, Adrian, she hissed. Those men downstairs are Spetsnaz-trained mercenaries, likely the Wimpel group based on their entry pattern. They are here for the kid in 402. They will kill anyone who gets in their way, and they will kill everyone else just to eliminate witnesses. Now you can die screaming in a stairwell, or you can do exactly what I tell you. Hayes stared at her. He looked into the watery blue eyes of the woman who changed bedpans, and he saw a shark staring back. He nodded, terrified. Good. Take the staff and the ambulatory patients into the MRI suite. The magnet is quenched, but the room is shielded with copper and lead. It's bulletproof and blocks radio signals. They can't detonate remote explosives through the walls. What are you going to do? Hayes stammered. Margaret checked the chamber of her pistol. I'm going to go down to the pharmacy. Why? Because I need bleach, ammonia, and a distraction. Margaret moved. She didn't run. She glided. She knew this hospital better than the architects. She knew that the ventilation maintenance hatch in the janitor's closet on the 4th floor dropped directly into the server room on the 3rd. She slipped into the darkness of the vents, just as the elevator chimed at the end of the hall. 3 men stepped out. They raised their rifles. Clear left, clear right. They advanced toward the nurse's station. The floor was empty. A single coffee cup spun on the desk, spilling its contents, indicating someone had just left. Check the rooms, one mercenary commanded. As the man moved past the janitorial closet, he didn't notice the grate was loose. He didn't hear the soft exhale of breath above him. Margaret watched him through the slats. She analyzed his kit. Level 4 body armor, helmets with comms, night vision on their belts, not deployed yet. She needed a rifle. The pistol wouldn't punch through their plates. She waited. Patience was the primary weapon of her old trade. In 1992, she had waited 3 days in a muddy ditch in Bosnia for a target to smoke a cigarette. 5 minutes in a ventilation shaft was a vacation. The mercenary, a brute named Gregor, paused directly under the vent to check his radio. Floor 4 clear. Moving to VIP. Now, Margaret didn't just drop. She descended like a guillotine. She kicked the grate free and landed on Gregor's shoulders. Before he could shout, she drove the heel of her orthopedic shoe into the base of his neck, right where the helmet met the armor. It was a calculated strike to the vagus nerve. He crumpled. Margaret rode him to the ground, stripping his rifle before he even hit the floor. She rolled, coming up in a crouch, the HK-416 now in her shoulder. The other 2 men at the end of the hall turned at the sound of the thud. Thwack, thwack! Margaret double-tapped the first man. 2 rounds to the T-box, the triangle between the eyes and nose. His head snapped back, and he dropped. The 3rd man dove behind a linen cart, spraying automatic fire down the hall. Bullets tore into the drywall, exploding clouds of white dust. Margaret didn't flinch. She counted the rounds. 28, 29, 30. Click. He went to reload. Margaret stood up and walked forward, firing single, suppressed shots through the linen cart. She knew the kinetic energy would transfer. The man screamed and fell out from behind the cart, clutching his leg. She closed the distance. She looked down at him. He was young, maybe 25. He looked up at the grey-haired woman in baggy scrubs, his eyes wide with shock. Who are you? He wheezed, blood bubbling on his lips. Margaret looked at him with that same detached professionalism she used when checking a pulse. "I'm the charge nurse," she said. She knocked him unconscious with the butt of the rifle. "And visiting hours are over." She tapped her earpiece. She had taken the fallen mercenary's radio. She listened to the chatter. "Gregor, report. Why is there shooting?" The voice was Voron's. Margaret keyed the mic. She spoke in flawless Russian, with a specific, regional dialect from the Ural Mountains. "Gregor is indisposed. This is Ward 4. You have made a significant tactical error." There was a silence on the line. Then a dark, confused laugh. "Who is this? Police?" "No," Margaret replied. "If I were police, you would be negotiating. I am the woman who is going to disassemble you, piece by piece." She ripped the radio off her vest and threw it down the hall. She knew they could triangulate the signal. She needed to keep moving. But she had bought time, and she had a rifle. Now, she just needed to keep the senator's son alive until the cavalry arrived. But Margaret knew something the mercenaries didn't. The cavalry wasn't just the police. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small black device that looked like a pager. It was older technology, satellite uplinked. It had one button. She hadn't pressed it in 12 years. It was the Broken Arrow distress beacon for Task Force 121, a unit that officially didn't exist. She pressed it. Somewhere in Virginia, a red light started blinking on a secure console. And at a naval air station in Oceania, a team of men who were currently sleeping or playing cards were about to get a very loud wake-up call. The fourth floor was silent, save for the hum of the backup generators. Margaret had killed the main breaker for the East Wing. She was no longer wearing the oversized trench coat. She had stripped down to her scrub pants and a tight, dark thermal undershirt she wore for her arthritis. Her arms were wiry and scarred. Around her waist, she had fashioned a makeshift battle belt, using surgical tubing and gauze to hold the spare magazines she'd scavenged. She moved into the pediatric ward. It was colorful, murals of giraffes and lions on the walls. Now it was a killing field. She needed to funnel them. Margaret knew that Voron wouldn't stop. He was a professional. He would realize his flankers were dead, and he would consolidate his force. They would come down the main corridor in a shield wall formation, heavy ballistic shields in front, rifles behind. Unstoppable in a narrow hallway, unless the hallway wasn't there anymore. Margaret slipped into the janitorial closet near the oxygen storage room. She grabbed 4 portable O2 tanks, the heavy steel ones. She dragged them into the hallway, positioning them behind the heavy oak reception desk of the pediatric wing. Then she opened the valves. Hiss. Pure oxygen flooded the enclosed space behind the desk. It wasn't flammable on its own, but it was an accelerant. It made things burn faster, hotter, and more violently. She took a defibrillator from the crash cart. She set the charge to 360 joules. She rigged it so that the shock button was depressed by the weight of a heavy medical textbook, but the circuit was broken by a thin strip of plastic she tied to a fishing line found in the lost and found box. A tripwire. She retreated 30 yards down the hall, melting into the shadows of the linen alcove. 3 minutes later, they came. 6 men. 2 ballistic shields. They moved like a tank, heavy boots thudding in unison. Their flashlights cut through the gloom. "Clear," the point man grunted. "Check the desk," Voron commanded from the rear. She could be hiding. The point man moved the shield slightly to check behind the reception desk. His boot caught the fishing line. The plastic strip yanked free. The circuit closed. Snap crack. The defibrillator pads arched. In an oxygen-rich environment, the spark didn't just flash, it detonated. The air itself seemed to catch fire. The O2 tanks didn't explode like bombs, but they ruptured from the sudden heat, turning into superheated missiles. Boom! The reception desk disintegrated. The blast wave threw the two shield bearers backward, as if they had been hit by a truck. The fireball rolled down the ceiling, scorching the giraffes and lions. Chaos. Margaret stepped out from her cover. She didn't spray bullets wildly. She raised the HK-4 stabilized her breathing, and fired. Pop! 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 Controlled. Efficient. One mercenary went down, a round finding the gap in his armor under the armpit. Another took a round to the thigh and collapsed, screaming. Voron, however, was fast. He dove into a patient room, avoiding the blast and the gunfire. RPG! He screamed. Bring up the RPG! Blow the whole floor! Margaret's eyes widened. They had rocket-propelled grenades inside a hospital. These weren't just mercenaries. They were terrorists. If they fired an RPG in here, the structural damage could collapse the floor onto the NICU below. Babies in incubators. She couldn't let that happen. She broke cover, sprinting toward the VIP wing where the senator's son was hiding. She needed a better vantage point. As she ran, a spray of bullets chased her, chewing up the linoleum at her heels. A shard of tile sliced her cheek, but she didn't slow down. She dove into room 402. "Who's there?" a voice squeaked. Toby Mitchell, the 20-year-old junkie witness, was huddled under the bed, shaking. He looked pathetic, pale, sweating, withdrawal kicking in. Margaret slammed the door and locked it. She dragged a heavy dresser in front of it. "Get up," she commanded, breathless. She wiped the blood from her cheek. Toby crawled out, staring at her. You're the nurse. The one who gave me the sponge bath." "Things have changed, Toby. Can you shoot?" "What?" "No. I play Call of Duty, that's it." Margaret shoved the spare pistol, the Sig Sauer, into his hands. "Point the loud end at the door. If anyone comes through who isn't me, pull the trigger until it stops clicking." "Where are you going?" "I'm going to flank them. Stay low." Margaret moved to the window. We were on the 4th floor. Outside, the rain was torrential. Below, police lights washed the building in blue and red, but they were holding back. They didn't know the situation inside. She looked at the ledge. It was 6 inches wide, wet concrete. "You're crazy," Toby whispered. "I'm retired," Margaret corrected. She opened the window. The wind howled, freezing rain lashing her face. She climbed out. 10 miles away, at O'Hare International Airport, a black, unmarked Gulfstream 5 sat on the tarmac, engines idling. Inside, the cabin didn't look like a luxury jet. It was stripped bare, fitted with comms racks and weapon lockers. Lieutenant Commander James Viper Miller looked at the laptop screen. His face was a mask of hard angles and stubble. He was the team leader of SEAL Team 6, Red Squadron. They were en route to a training exercise in Nevada when the diversion order came through. "What do we have, Jocko?" Miller asked his comms officer. "Sir, we have a distress beacon. High priority. Code Black." Miller frowned. "Code Black? That's busted intel or a compromised safe house. Who is it?" "Signal matches a legacy ID," Jocko said, tapping his keyboard. He paused. He looked up, his face pale. "Sir, the ID matches Wraith." The cabin went silent. Even the guys sharpening their knives in the back stopped. "Wraith?" Miller repeated. "That's a myth. That's the Grey Lady. Task Force 121. I thought she died in Damascus in 09. Signal is live, sir. GPS coordinates confirm Providence Memorial Hospital, downtown Chicago. Local PD reports a hostile takeover. Multiple shooters. Heavy weapons." Miller stood up. The training mission was over. "Gear up!" he roared. "Full rattle. We have a Tier 1 asset in the wind. We are wheels up in 30 seconds. Pilot, get us to the roof of that hospital. I don't care about flight paths. Punch it." One of the younger SEALs, a burly operator named Davis, looked at Miller as he strapped on his plate carrier. "Boss, who is Wraith? I've heard the stories, but—" Miller checked his MP Evans submachine gun. "Davis, before you were born, she was hunting cartels in Colombia with a Garrett wire. She trained the guy who trained me. If she pushed that button, she's not asking for help. She's letting us know there's going to be a body count, and she wants someone to clean it up." Miller grabbed his helmet. "But if she pushed it, it means she's out of ammo. We move fast, no prisoners. Anyone not in scrubs or a hospital gown is a target." The Gulf Stream roared down the runway, banking hard. They weren't landing at the airport. They were jumping. "Halo drop?" Davis asked, grinning. "Low altitude," Miller said. "Fast rope onto the roof. The storm will mask our approach. Let's go say hello to Mom." Back at Providence Memorial, the situation was critical. Margaret had shimmied along the wet ledge, flanking the hallway. She smashed the window of room 406 with the butt of her rifle and rolled inside. She was now behind the mercenary line. She could see them in the hallway. They were preparing the RPG. They were aiming at room 402, where Toby was. Margaret didn't hesitate. She raised the HK-4R-16. Thwack, thwack. The man holding the RPG launcher took 2 rounds to the back of the head. He dropped the launcher. It didn't fire, thank God. The other 3 mercenaries spun around, realizing they were surrounded. "She's behind us!" They opened fire on room 406. Bullets shredded the drywall. Margaret dove behind a heavy steel instrument cart. Sparks flew as rounds pinged off the metal. She was pinned. She had half a magazine left. Maybe 14 rounds. "Grenade!" one of the men shouted. Margaret saw the small, dark object bounce into the room. A flash bang! She scrambled backward, covering her ears and closing her eyes. Bang! Even with the precautions, the concussion rattled her teeth. Her ears rang like church bells. Disoriented, she tried to stand, but the room swam. A boot kicked the instrument cart aside. Voron stood over her. He looked like a nightmare. His face was burned from the oxygen explosion, the skin on one side raw and red. He held a pistol aimed at her forehead. "You are good," Voron spat, blood dripping from his chin. "For a grandmother." Margaret looked up at him. She was on her knees. Her hands were empty. Her rifle was 5 feet away. "I'm not a grandmother," she wheezed. "I never had kids. The job didn't allow it." "A pity," Voron sneered. "No one to mourn you." He tightened his finger on the trigger. Margaret tensed her legs. She had one move left, a knife in her boot. It was a suicide move. She would die, but maybe she could take his femoral artery with her. She locked eyes with him. "Do it." Voron smiled. Then the window behind Voron exploded. It wasn't a bullet. It was a pair of black boots swinging in on a rope. Glass shattered inward. A dark shape swung through the breach, colliding with Voron like a wrecking ball. Voron was knocked sideways, his shot going wild into the ceiling. The figure landed in a crouch. Multicam black uniform. Quad-lens night vision goggles flipped up. An MP7 raised. Put. 2 suppressed rounds hit the mercenary in the doorway before he could blink. Margaret didn't move. She knew that silhouette. "Clear left," a voice shouted from the roof. "Clear right." 3 more figures rappelled through the shattered window, weapons raised. They moved with a violence of action that was terrifying to behold. They flowed into the hallway. Pop, pop. Pop, pop. The sounds of the remaining mercenaries dying were short and final. The SEALs didn't fight fair. They eliminated threats. In 10 seconds, the 4th floor was silent again. The first SEAL, the one who had kicked Voron, stood up. He kept his weapon trained on Voron, who was groaning on the floor, clutching a broken rib. The SEAL turned to Margaret. He didn't lower his weapon, but his posture softened. "Secure," he said into his radio. "Jackpot is safe. The floor is ours." He reached up and pulled off his helmet and balaclava. It was Lieutenant Commander Miller. He looked older than Margaret remembered, more grey in his beard, but the eyes were the same. He looked at Margaret, bruised, bleeding, covered in drywall dust, wearing scrubs and holding a stolen rifle. He looked at the carnage around her, the burned hallway, the dead mercenaries, the strategic use of the environment. He smiled, a genuine, lopsided grin. "You look like hell, Maggie." Margaret let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 20 years. She slumped against the wall, the adrenaline finally fading, leaving her shaking. "You're late, James," she said, her voice cracking. "I told you to work on your cardio." Miller chuckled. He walked over and offered her a hand. He didn't pull her up like a frail old woman. He grasped her forearm, the warrior's grip. "We got hung up in traffic," Miller said. "Chicago drivers, you know." He pulled her to her feet. "Where's the VIP?" Miller asked. "Room 402, Margaret said, dusting off her scrubs. "He's wet, scared, and probably going through withdrawals. But he's alive." Miller nodded to his men. "Davis, secure the package. Martinez, watch the stairwell. Police SWAT is coming up. Don't let them shoot us by accident." "Copy that, boss." Miller turned back to Margaret. He looked at Voron, who was trying to crawl away. Miller casually stepped on Voron's hand, pinning him to the floor without looking down. "So," Miller said, "you retired. You came here to empty bedpans." "It was quiet," Margaret said. "I liked the quiet." "Clearly," Miller gestured to the destroyed ward. "You have a funny way of showing it." Just then, the stairwell door burst open. "Police! Drop your weapons!" A team of Chicago PD SWAT officers flooded the hallway, shields up, rifles screaming. They saw the bodies. They saw the men in tactical gear. They saw the old woman. "Drop it! On the ground! Now!" The SWAT lead screamed, adrenaline pumping. He aimed his rifle at Miller. Miller didn't drop his weapon. He didn't raise his hands. He just held up a hand, calmly, palm out. "Stand down, officers," Miller barked. His voice was command authority personified. "This is a federal operation. Situation is secure." "I said get on the ground." The SWAT officer wasn't buying it. He saw men with guns and dead bodies. He shifted his aim toward Margaret, who was still holding the HK-416. "Drop the gun, lady! Do it now!" Margaret looked tired. She slowly bent down to place the rifle on the floor. "Don't move!" the cop yelled, his finger trembling on the trigger. He was panicked. He was about to make a mistake. Miller stepped in front of Margaret. He put his armored back between the cop's rifle and the nurse. "Whoa! Easy!" Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous. "You take that weapon off her right now, Sergeant. She's a suspect. She's armed." "She is not a suspect," Miller said, staring the cop down. "And she is not a civilian." Miller looked around at his team. The SEALs had all stopped what they were doing. They formed a loose circle around Margaret. "Davis," Miller said. "Yeah, boss?" "Tell these gentlemen who they are yelling at." Davis stepped forward. He looked at the cops with disdain. "You boys have any idea who that is?" Davis pointed at Margaret. "That's Margaret Hale, call sign Wraith. She has a higher clearance than your chief of police, the mayor, and the governor combined. She's a Medal of Honor nominee, but they couldn't give it to her because her mission was classified." The cops lowered their weapons slightly, confused. They looked at the grey-haired woman with the bad hip. Miller turned to Margaret. He snapped his heels together. It was a crisp, sharp movement that echoed in the hallway. He brought his hand up to his brow, a perfect salute. "Ma'am," Miller said, "transport is waiting. We're taking you home." The other SEALs, Davis, Martinez, and 2 others, snapped to attention. They saluted. "Ma'am," they chorused. Margaret looked at them. For the first time in the night, her eyes welled up. She wasn't the grey lady. She wasn't the ghost. She was just Maggie. "At ease, boys," she whispered. "My shift isn't over. I still have to chart this mess." The dawn broke over Chicago in shades of bruised purple and grey. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the asphalt of the ambulance bay slick and reflecting the flashing lights of 100 police cruisers, FBI, SUVs, and black government Tahoes. Providence Memorial was a crime scene. But to the people in the know, it was a battlefield cleanup. Margaret sat on the back bumper of an ambulance, a thermal blanket draped over her shoulders. A paramedic, a young man who looked terrified to even touch her, was cleaning the cut on her cheek. "Does it hurt, Mum?" he asked, his hands trembling slightly. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She was watching the body bags being wheeled out. Not the patients. Thanks to her diversion, the civilians had made it. The body bags contained Voron and his team. "It stings a little," Margaret said softly. "But pain reminds you you're alive." 10 yards away, Dr. Adrian Hayes was giving a statement to a detective. He kept glancing over at Margaret. He looked like a man whose entire worldview had been shattered and hastily glued back together. He walked over, hesitantly. The arrogant thoracic surgeon was gone. In his place was a man who had seen a 60-year-old woman dismantle a kill squad. "Maggie! Ms. Hale," Hayes stammered. Margaret looked up. Her eyes were tired. The asset was fading back, replaced by the nurse. "It's still Margaret, Adrian, and you have rounds in 20 minutes. Mrs. Higgins in 304 needs her drainage tube checked." Hayes laughed, a hysterical, incredulous sound. "Rounds? Margaret, half the hospital is destroyed. The FBI is seizing our security footage. I saw a general yelling at the chief of police. And you're talking about drainage tubes? The work doesn't stop just because the world is ending," she said simply. "That's the job." Just then, Lieutenant Commander Miller approached. He had changed out of his combat gear into civilian clothes, jeans, a hoodie, a baseball cap. He looked like any other construction worker or dad, except for the way he scanned the perimeter every 3 seconds. "Ma'am," Miller nodded to Hayes, dismissing him with a look. Hayes took the hint and scrambled away. "Report, Viper," Margaret said, her voice low. "Toby Mitchell is secure. He's on a bird to a black site in Nevada. He's singing like a canary. The intel he gave us just rolled up 3 arms trafficking cells in Eastern Europe." "You did good, Maggie." "I broke my hip," she grumbled, shifting the ice pack on her leg. "Again." Miller smirked. "We'll get the Navy to pay for a titanium one. Upgrade you to the bionic woman." He handed her a cup of coffee. It was terrible hospital coffee, burnt and lukewarm. She took a sip and sighed happily. "So," Miller said, his tone turning serious. "The agency. They want you back in. They saw the footage before we scrubbed it. They say you haven't lost a step. They want you to train the new recruits at the farm." Margaret looked at the hospital. She looked at the nurses, huddling together, crying and hugging. She saw Jenny, the young student she had sent to the closet, waving at her tentatively. "No," Margaret said. "No." Miller raised an eyebrow. "You'd rather clean bedpans and take orders from guys like Hayes?" "Adrian is a good surgeon. He's just an idiot," Margaret said. "And yes, I would." "Why?" Margaret took another sip of coffee. "Because out there, James, in the life, you save the world, but you never see the faces of the people you save. It's abstract, numbers on a screen. Here, when I hold a patient's hand, when I stop a bleed, I see them walk out the door. I get to see them live." Miller nodded slowly. He understood. The quiet life. The quiet life, she agreed. Well, Miller stood up. I can't promise the agency will listen, but I'll tell them you're dead. Again. You're a good boy, James. One more thing, Miller said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He placed it in her hand. The boys wanted you to have this, since the government won't give you the real one. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of first responders. Margaret opened the box. Inside wasn't a medal. It was a patch, the trident insignia of the SEALs, but the eagle was holding a caduceus, the medical staff, instead of a trident. It was custom-made, on the back, etched in tiny letters. To the Grey Lady. Only easy day was yesterday. Margaret closed her hand around it. She smiled. Then she stood up, winced at the pain in her hip, and walked toward the ER entrance. "Jenny!" she barked, her voice raspy and commanding. "Stop crying and grab a mop. We have patients coming in." 3 months had passed since the night Providence Memorial burned, but the smell of ozone and antiseptic never really left the 4th floor. At least, not for the people who had been there. To the public, it was a gas main explosion exacerbated by structural failure. The official report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction, drafted by men in Virginia who didn't exist, signed by officials who didn't read it. The bodies of Voron and his Spetsnaz mercenaries had been cremated at a facility in Delaware before the sun had risen the next morning. The bullet holes in the walls were spackled over, the scorched linoleum replaced with pristine white tile, and the shattered windows reglazed with higher-grade ballistic glass, quietly paid for by a private donor. But ghosts are harder to patch over than drywall. It was a Tuesday night, raining again. It seemed it always rained on Tuesdays now. Agent Richard Dawson of the CIA's Office of Inspector General sat in a parked sedan across the street from the hospital. The windshield wipers slapped back and forth, a metronome counting down seconds that didn't matter. On his lap sat a thick file marked Classified, Eyes Only, Project Wraith. He had been studying the file for 6 weeks. He had watched the recovered security footage until his eyes bled. He had interviewed the SEALs, who were tight-lipped and respectful. He had interviewed the hospital staff, who were traumatized and confused. There was a mathematical error in the narrative, a variable that refused to solve. Dawson watched the hospital entrance. At 11:45 p.m., the sliding doors opened. Margaret Hale walked out. She looked exactly as she had in the dossier photos from 20 years ago, just with more lines around her eyes and a slight limp in her left leg. She wore a beige raincoat, sensible shoes, and carried a tote bag that likely contained a Tupperware of leftover casserole. She looked like a grandmother. She looked like a woman who knit scarves for charity. Dawson shivered. He knew better. He had seen the footage from the hallway camera before it was shot out. He had seen how she moved. That wasn't just training, that was artistry. He reached for the door handle to get out and confront her, to ask the question that had been keeping him awake. But then he stopped. He looked at the Grey Lady, standing under the awning, checking her watch. He remembered the warning Lieutenant Commander Miller had given him during the debriefing. "Sir, if you go digging in her garden, make sure you're ready to be the fertilizer." Dawson hesitated. His hand dropped from the latch. He watched Margaret Hale walk to her rusted Ford Taurus, get in, and drive away. He started his car and drove in the opposite direction. Some stones, he decided, were better left unturned. Inside the hospital, the night shift was settling into its rhythm. Dr. Adrian Hayes sat at the nurse's station, staring at a tablet. He wasn't reading. He was staring at the reflection of the hallway behind him on the black screen. Hayes had changed. The brash, Yale-educated arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a twitchy, hyper-observant quietness. He no longer barked orders. He asked for things politely. He checked the exits when he entered a room. He had started taking boxing lessons at a gym in South Chicago. He looked at the empty chair where Margaret usually sat. She had just clocked out. "Dr. Hayes?" He jumped, nearly knocking over his coffee. It was Jenny, the young nurse. She looked concerned. "Are you okay? You've been staring at that screen for 10 minutes. "I'm fine, Jenny," Hayes exhaled, adjusting his glasses. "Just thinking." "About Maggie?" Hayes looked at her. "Yeah, about Maggie." "She's doing better, I think," Jenny said, organizing a stack of charts. "Her hip is bothering her less, and she brought in cookies yesterday. She's just Maggie, you know. It's hard to believe what happened. Sometimes I think I dreamed it. The guns, the smoke. It wasn't a dream," Hayes whispered. He stood up and walked over to the supply closet, the one with the reinforced door where Margaret had hidden them. He opened it. It smelled of bleach and floor wax. Hayes reached behind a stack of paper towel rolls. He pulled out a clipboard he had hidden there weeks ago. It was his own personal investigation. Hayes was a surgeon. His life was defined by cause and effect. Aorta severs, blood pressure drops, bacteria enters, infection spreads. He understood the mechanics of chaos, and what happened that night hadn't been chaos. It had been a symphony. He looked at his notes. Fact 1. The oxygen tanks used to blow up the reception desk. Margaret had moved them from the storage unit to the hallway at 11:30 p.m. 15 minutes before the first shot was fired. She claimed she was organizing. Fact 2. The magnetic locks on the VIP wing had been disabled manually from the inside at 11:40 p.m. This forced the mercenaries to funnel toward the pediatric ward, directly into the kill zone. Fact 3. The propofol drip on the patient in bed 3. Margaret had increased the dosage, knocking him out cold so he wouldn't wake up during the firefight. She did that at 11:20 p.m. Hayes closed his eyes. The realization made his stomach turn. She didn't just react to the attack. She was waiting for it. He put the clipboard back. He would never mention this to anyone. He knew, with a primal certainty, that Margaret Hale liked him. She tolerated him. She even protected him. But he also knew that if he became a loose end, the Grey Lady would tie him off with the same efficiency she used to suture a wound. He went back to the desk, picked up his tablet, and went to save a life. That was his job. He would leave the god playing to the old woman in the beige coat. Margaret's apartment was located in a brick walk-up in Andersonville. It was modest, clean, and utterly forgettable. She locked the door behind her. 3 locks, 2 deadbolts, and a floor latch she had installed herself. She hung up her wet coat. She placed her keys in a bowl. The apartment smelled of lavender and old paper. Her cat, a one-eared stray named Churchill, rubbed against her ankles. I know, she cooed, her voice raspy and warm. "I'm late. The traffic was murder." She fed the cat and made herself a cup of herbal tea. She moved to the living room, which was lined with bookshelves. Dickens, Austen, Tolstoy, the classics. She sat in her armchair, groaning as her hip popped. She took a sip of tea and closed her eyes, listening to the rain against the glass. For an hour, she was just an old woman resting after a hard shift. Then she opened her eyes. The warmth vanished from them, replaced by a glacial, predatory clarity. She reached down to the side of the armchair. She ran her hand along the wood until she felt a slight indentation. She pressed it. A hidden catch released. A panel in the floorboards popped up. Margaret reached into the cavity and pulled out a black pelican case. She set it on her lap and opened it. Inside wasn't a gun. It was a laptop, disconnected from the internet, and a series of physical dossiers. She powered on the laptop. It booted up a secure, encrypted OS that didn't exist on any civilian market. She opened a file named Active Operations. A map of the world appeared. There were red dots scattered across it. One in Berlin, one in Caracas, one in Jakarta, and one, blinking slowly, in Chicago. She clicked on the Chicago dot. A profile appeared. Target, Voron, deceased. Affiliation, Vimpel, syndicate. 9 status, eliminated. Method, hostile environment entrapment. Proxy force utilized. U.S. Navy SEALs. Margaret stared at the screen. She typed a short entry into the log. Log 409. Target Voron successfully liquidated. Asset acted as bait to draw target into a controlled engagement zone. Providence Memorial proved to be an adequate kill box. Local law enforcement and media containment successful. Dr. Hayes is suspicious, but manageable. The SEAL team performed within expected parameters, though their response time was 4 minutes slower than projected. We'll note in their training evaluations. She closed the file. This was the truth that Agent Dawson suspected, but couldn't prove. The truth that Dr. Hayes felt, but couldn't articulate. Margaret hadn't retired. She hadn't left the life. The life had just become too loud, too clumsy. The agencies were full of bureaucrats and politicians. They couldn't do what needed to be done. So she had created her own unit, a unit of one. She wasn't hiding at Providence Memorial. She was hunting from it. She used the hospital's admission records to track international criminals who came into the city for treatment under fake names. She used the chaotic environment of the ER to stage accidents, overdoses, and complications. Voron hadn't found her. She had leaked her own location to the underworld data brokers 6 months ago. She invited him. She knew he would come for the senator's son, so she made sure she was the charge nurse on duty that night. She made sure the oxygen tanks were ready. She made sure the beacon was in her pocket. She had turned a hospital into a mousetrap, and she had used the Navy SEALs as the spring. She closed the laptop and put it back in the case. She lowered the case back into the floor and snapped the panel shut. She stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at the street below. A dark sedan was driving away, Agent Dawson finally giving up. Margaret smiled. It was a small, tight smile. She walked over to the mirror in the hallway. She looked at her reflection, the grey hair, the wrinkles, the soft, unassuming face of a caregiver. "You're getting slow, Maggie," she whispered to herself. "You let him get a shot off." She straightened her cardigan. She adjusted a hairpin. Tomorrow was Wednesday. Clinic day. They were expecting a high-profile admission, a diplomat from Venezuelan intelligence who needed discreet dialysis, a man who had ordered the bombing of a school bus in 2014. Margaret looked at her reflection one last time. "Looks like he's going to have complications with his medication," she murmured. Churchill the cat meowed from the kitchen. "Coming, sweetie," Margaret called out, her voice shifting back to the gentle, raspy hum of the nurse. She turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness. The nurse was off duty. The wraith was just getting started. And that is the legend of Margaret Hale. To the world, she's just the woman who checks your vitals. But to the men who operate in the shadows, she is the titan who walks among us. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? The quiet janitor, the nice old lady at the library, the nurse holding your hand. Who were they before? What fires did they walk through so that we could live in peace? If this story gave you chills, or if you have a Margaret in your life who deserves to be celebrated, hit that like button right now. It helps us share these stories of hidden valor. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We have more stories of real-life heroes that the history books forgot coming up next week. Until then, stay safe, and be nice to your nurse. You never know if she's packing a cig sour.